Welcome to Bits and Pieces Quilting. Today we are going to make this simple but effective square and a square quilt, so stay tuned. Hi, I'm Michelle, and today, thanks to all of your feedback, I'm going to show you how to make this quick and simple but really beautiful quilt. It's a square and a square design, and in this case I've used some really great, it's starting to sag a little, this really great scrappy fabric from Northcott Fabrics. This is going to go to Quilts of Valor, so there's a lot of Canadiana themed fabric in this project. It is made up of, Jason's behind the camera, I'm going to ask him to make sure that we focus over here. It's made up of a center square with two borders to finish off the block. And then in order to make the quilt really stand out, I added these sashing strips. So let's go up to the sewing room and I will show you how to do it. So let me show you the block that we are working towards. And it's this one with a 5-inch center and then the two borders. And for this project, I have just dug into the scrap bin and made a whole ton of different ones. I think they look super cute and they all are on the same theme of fabric. So I think they're going to go together really beautifully in the final project. So to make the blocks, you are going to need a 5-inch square. And I'm just going to use this one with some of the words from the Canadian National Anthem on it as my example. It's a 5-inch square. So our first borders are 1 inch wide, and you need two pieces, of course, that are 5 inches, and then the top and bottom borders that are 6 inches. And then the second borders are 2 inches wide, and those pieces need to be 6 inches for the short sides and 9 inches for the top and bottom. So I'm going to go sew these, press them, so the top and bottom, press them, and then I'll come back, show you that, and then we'll add the red borders. These are the first borders, the 1-inch borders that have been added. I have just pressed the seams to one side, towards the dark side. Normally I press my seams open. If you watch my channel, you know that that's a big thing with me. But in this case, it just seemed really easy just to press the seams towards the dark side. And so now the next step is to add the second borders. So I'll add the 6-inch pieces to the sides, the 9-inch pieces to the top and bottom. And this is the final block. I think it looks super cute. It's really simple and easy. It's a great way, almost like a picture frame. You pick your motif in the middle, and then you pick the little mattings to surround it to really show it off. One of my favorites in this pile is this. It's a little simple, but I love the little maple leaf in the middle with its little frame around the edges. So these are 9 inches, 9-inch blocks. They'll finish in the quilt at 8.5 inches. So for me, I thought 6 by 8 was going to work, but then I did the math, and that's only going to give me 51 inches by 68 inches for a 6 by 8 quilt, which is a little bit small for Quilts of Valor. They prefer at least 55 by 70 inches. And on top of that, let me turn this camera off, start it again, and show you what a small layout on the floor looks like, and we'll talk through some of the finishing options. These are the first 3 rows laid out on my sewing room floor. It's pretty chaotic, but I think they are really charming little blocks. And like I said, it's a tiny bit small for Quilts of Valor. And I also wasn't 100% sure that I loved this layout. You could absolutely just sew these blocks together and it would look really cute. But I think the way I'm going to write the pattern and the way that I'm going to finish this project is by adding a little bit of sashing. So let me get a few pieces and I'll show you what I mean. I've just laid a few pieces of black on the floor in between my blocks, and this is going to be the way that I'm going to finish it. With 1.5-inch sashing around and through all of the blocks, it'll just give it a further little frame, I think, and separate the blocks from each other. Give them just a little bit more drama. And then hopefully I'll have enough black to put a very thin, maybe a 2.5-inch border around the outside edge. So that's going to give me an extra 5 inches to my width, plus maybe then another 4 or 5 inches in terms of border. So I think it's going to be a perfect size for Quilts of Valor, and it's going to add just a little bit more drama to the quilt. So I'm going to cut those sashing pieces now and start to put it together. I have the first couple of rows sewn together, and I want to show you a few things. Number one is whenever I'm doing rows like this with sashing, I always use cornerstones, and they're really hard to see here because they match in this case. But I always use cornerstones. Sometimes they're a different color, but sometimes they're exactly the same color of what I'm sewing together. And I do that so that I can get this lined up. I've tried in the past with this being a single piece of fabric cut to the right length, but getting these parts of the borders to line up is really difficult for me. And I find the best way to do that is with sashing and cornerstones, so that I press the sashing. In this case, I've pressed blocks towards the sashing, and so the cornerstones get pressed outwards, and I'm able to nest these seams and get them to line up properly. I've had instances in the past before I adopted this technique permanently where the rows would kind of jog and I just could never get them lined up. So I always use cornerstones, and honestly, especially in this project, no one's ever going to notice that there's tiny little squares in here, but they really make it easier to line up all of these pieces. And then, because I'm using some scraps, I'm using some leftovers, I've found that I need to piece some of my strips. And can you see? I'm going to zoom really close. Look, there's a seam there. Can you see that? You can see it when I'm that close maybe, but even as I start to pan out a little bit, that just disappears. So that might not work with a heavily printed fabric. You know, if our little Anukshuk was made up of a pieced fabric, you might be able to really see a seam like that. But in this case, I can barely even feel the seam, never mind see it. So I want to encourage you to use up your pieces, especially if it's not going to show. And cornerstones, really, for me, the secret to putting sashings together like this and making things line up. I've got the quilt laid out on the floor of my sewing room, and you can see I've done it in two sections. I do this all the time because I don't want to have huge pieces of fabric trying to wrestle them under my sewing machine. So the first 4 rows are up there, and then the second 4 rows are right here. I'm really happy with the way the sashing has turned out. It's added a little bit more size to the final quilt, and it separates those blocks. So some of the crazy maple leaf patterns in the borders, there's a little bit of a space for your eye to rest with those black sashing pieces. So they were just 1.5 inch strips. They come up to 1 inch pieces in the quilt, and I think it looks really good. I'm going to sew these piece A and piece B together, and then I'm going to add a border. I think probably 2.5 or a 3 inch border. I don't want it too big, purposefully just to finish the edge of the quilt, but not to make it a big 5 or 6 inch border. And I don't have that kind of fabric anyway. So probably a 2.5 or a 3 inch border. And then I'm going to carefully swing around so as not to make you a little dizzy. This is what I'm going to use for the binding. This is a stripe that was in the box of leftovers, and I'm honestly not really sure how else to use this. So this, I think, is going to make a really cute binding with these little colors that will then show up along the edge. So I'm going to cut that for the binding. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. The free pattern will be on my website at www.bitsandpiecesquilting.com. In this case, I have varied up the centers and the borders for each of the squares, but you could do this with consistency if you wanted. Imagine an I Spy fabric in the middle, bordered out by 2 bright colors. Or you could imagine a Tula Pink fabric in the middle with just some white or some bright colored borders around the edge. You can do whatever you want, and the color combinations are endless. So I hope you'll give this a try. Thanks very much for watching, and don't forget to make the most of your fabric bits and pieces.